All right, so, and the topic is poverty, dignity, and the kingdom of ends. So what am I going to do is to give you an introduction about poverty as a violation of dignity in Kant's ethics. Then I'll ask what it means to lead a decent life. And then I'll ask what it means not to respect the moral status of persons. I'll show you 3 theses. And then I ask, what would it mean to respect the moral status of persons? Then presenting 2 more theses. And then I'll conclude that poverty is an exclusion from humanity. Okay. So let me start with an introduction about poverty as violation of dignity. So Kant speaks of human beings as rational beings with needs. And this, we think, raises 2 aspects of dignity. The first aspect, very well known in a lot of discussions that are Kantian inspired, that's the equal moral standing of persons, and that refers to equal moral status. But there is also a second aspect which refers to humans as beings with needs, as physical beings, and that's the ability to actually lead a decent life, and that refers to our social status. And we think that a violation of dignity involves both aspects. So this raises 2 questions. What does it mean not to respect people's equal moral status in the context of poverty? And what does it mean not to be able to lead a decent life? And now, when it comes to the latter, what does it mean not to be able to lead a decent life? This seems exactly to be the case when you live in severe poverty. So I have a quote here from Robert McNamara, who used to be the president of the World Bank. And as you can see, it's from 1976, so a long time ago, but it's still true. So he states that poverty at the absolute level, which is what literally hundreds of millions of men, women, and most particularly children are suffering from in these countries, is life at a very margin of physical existence. The absolute poor are severely deprived human beings, struggling to survive in a set of squalid and degraded circumstances, almost beyond the power of our sophisticated imaginations and privileged circumstances to conceive. So, and then he concludes, severe poverty is a condition of life beneath the level of human decency. So that's exactly then referring to us as human beings with needs, so who are not able to lead a decent life in these circumstances. And now he also states that this is anachronistic because there are now at hand the economic and technological means to end it. And he stated that in 1976, and it's all true till the present day. Okay, so now the question, what does it mean to lead a decent life? Or what would it mean? And here, if we draw back on Avishai Margalit or Peter Schaber, so they describe a life in dignity as a life in self-respect. And here Peter Schaber refers to self-determination, which is the ability to choose between acceptable alternatives. And we can also include self-evaluation, as John Rawls states, so a person's sense of their own value, their secure conviction that their conception of their good, their plans of life is worth carrying out. And now you can feel humiliated, so if you're rejected by others, if their acts are intended to lead to a lack of control or to highlight your lack of control. And a loss of control is only then a violation of dignity if it also violates respect of the other's equal moral status. So you can experience a loss of control if you're very poor or if you're bodily in a condition where you're dependent of others. So that's a loss of the ability to lead a decent life, but that's not the same as a violation of dignity, because there must be a violator if we speak of a violation. And this is only the case if others don't respect your equal moral status. So if it's due to the acts of others, actively torture, exploitation, slavery, or unnatural dependency, or if it leads to loss of acknowledgement by others, for example, caused by dependency. Okay, so I think we've seen what it means or would mean to lead a decent life, or why a life in severe poverty might not be a decent life. And now the question is what it means not to respect the moral status of persons, because if we want to speak of a dignity violation, then the second aspect of dignity, equal moral status, must be implied and must be violated. So, and now I come closer to the core of the talk. Not respecting the moral status of persons, there are three theses. So this could be the case through instrumentalization. And I think that's, for Kantians, the standard case of not respecting the equal moral status of others when you treat them as mere means, when you instrumentalize them. But the poor are not instrumentalized. They're just left alone. So remember the McNamara quote. So they're living on the squalid margins of existence. They're like in the suburbs of some really big town. You can imagine they're just fighting for survival, but they're not instrumentalized by anyone. They're just left alone. One could then, and that's an observation that we made, Gareth and I, but also now we have a bigger project where also Martin, who will comment later, is involved, that the formula of humanity that is focused on never to treat others merely as means, so might be misleading when it comes to the topic of poverty, because we can also mistreat others if we treat them as mere things, so with indifference. Or we can treat them as negative ends, but that's another topic. So for the context of poverty, it's very important that you can just be indifferent to the poor and let them fight for survival without doing anything about it. And that's treating them as mere things. So now one could say the problem with poverty is not that you're instrumentalized, but that you're vulnerable to instrumentalization, because a lot of poor people, they, remember the Peter Schaber quote, do not have a choice between valuable alternatives, and so they have to take up exploitative jobs. And then that's the problem. So they're vulnerable to instrumentalization. And Liz Ashford and Griffin pointed that out. Or one could say the problem with poverty is that you are humiliated. And that's what Lucia Ley, then referring to Arthur Ripstein, pointed out. So that the poverty of the non-exploited can lead to humiliation if they are dependent on charity. Because if you're, for your survival, depend on my discretionary choice, whether I want to give you some money or not, then you are dependent on me, and that's humiliating. So therefore, Lucia Ley concludes that being a free agent is a matter of not being subject to the discretionary choices of others, And this means that they are forced, the poor, into a position in which the only way they can survive is by acting in a way that is not compatible with respecting their freedom, and that's demeaning. So that's the humiliation thesis. And also, if we would have, so that's of course what she points out, that there should be some social state that cares for the poor. But even if that's the case, so that you are in a social state and people pay taxes and you get some poverty relief, then you're still alimented, you're still dependent on others who are paying the taxes with which you can get your poverty relief. And this is also pointed out by Kant himself. So he himself says some really harsh things about poor people. So he says, be no man's lackey, do not let others treat with impunity on your rights, contract no debt for which you cannot give full security, do not accept favors you could do without, and do not be a parasite or a flatterer, or, what really differs from these only in degree, a beggar. Be thrifty, then, so that you will not become destitute. And I think Kant really sees that this kind of dependency, so when you are destitute, that this is humiliating. Okay, so now, what would it mean to respect the moral status of persons? And here, now, I come to the core of this talk. We have two more theses, namely the respect for ends in themselves. So, and that's what also Kant points out, you could give to beggars in a respectful way as if it were your duty. It's a duty of charity, but then Kant says as if you would owe that to the beggar. So that would show respect. And Kant is really, really careful. So when it comes to humans as physical beings in different social positions, so to notice the asymmetry between the one who is in the position to give and the one who is the needy part and is dependent on the giving of the other. And therefore, so Kant on the one hand, in the harsh quote, says we should be thrifty so that we don't come into this situation where we're dependent on others. But on the other hand, he says, so when you're in the good position and others are depending on you, then you should give in a way that does not humiliate them, that does not point out that there is this asymmetry. Or one should give anonymously, so that the dependent person doesn't owe you specifically something for having helped them. Okay, so, but still, as I have pointed out, even if you're giving in a respectful way, the poor people are depending on someone who helps them. So this doesn't dissolve the asymmetry. And therefore, and now comes the core thesis of our paper, and that's due to Gareth. So the idea is that we should not only refer to the formula of humanity when it comes to the topic of Kant and poverty, but we should shed more light and more focus on the kingdom of ends formula. And so if we read this closely, Kant speaks about a systematic union of rational beings through common objective laws that have as their purpose the relation of these beings to one another as ends and means. So, and that is very important because if we are ends and means to one another, then we're not in asymmetric positions to one another. And that would be the solution of the problem of poverty. So it might sound a little bit unrealistic, but in the end of the day, so as I pointed out, the problem of poverty is not only, as for example, Peter Singer frames it, so the poor are like drowning children in a shallow pond. So they need help, and what we need to do is to transfer money. And to this point, I try to show you that poverty is a dignity problem because not only because it affects your ability to lead a decent life in the way that you don't have things to eat and all these problems, but also insofar, from a Kantian standpoint, as it brings you into an asymmetric position to those who are not poor and could help you. And so in order, as physical beings, to reach what we are as moral beings, equal standing, so our social positions shouldn't be too unequal. And that would be reached if we could be ends and means for one another. Okay, let me give some examples. So we're ends and means to one another in commercial exchange. Or a very good example from Gareth, the decent employer. So by contrast, the exploitative employer fails to act as a means for the person she exploits. And a decent employer acts as a means for the worker. So, and decent work would, of course, be the optimal solution for the poverty problem, because then the poor wouldn't be dependent anymore, but could be useful members of the world. So, another Kant quotation. And that's kind of the vision that we want to bring out in our paper, so that poverty isn't simply, as it was framed in the debate, a problem of transferring goods, of helping the poor, but also of their social status as exclusion from humanity. So severe poverty involves two linked violations. It treats people as disposable like mere things. So that's a paper from Martin, where he points out that the poor, when they're treated with indifference, they're not treated like as mere means, but as mere things. They're simply ignored. So in Gareth's words, this casts them away. And poverty treats people as non-members because they can't interact as ends and means. They're excluded, they're cast out. And we can also think of degrees of exclusion. So relative poverty reduces someone's status, it casts them down. So they cannot take part in social life, for example. Let me refer that to Adam Smith, who says, so we should have the possibility to show ourselves in public without being ashamed. So for him it was that we have some shoes and some linen shirt, so that we can take part in social life. And for a lot of poor people, the problem is that this is not possible. So therefore, poverty excludes them, casts them away, out, and down. I come to the conclusion. Kantian political theorists largely reject the idea that we should frame poverty only or primarily as a matter of redistribution. Poverty is about powerlessness, deprivation of meaningful opportunities, denial of effective say and tenable options, lack of power over the terms on which one will act with and for others, and that's the exclusion problem. Its positive contrast is a kingdom of ends, people act as means to others' ends while being respected by others who act as means for theirs. And there would then be symmetry and not asymmetry. A key way we act as means to others' ends is by collaborating to open a worthwhile range of opportunities. Then people can pursue their own ends while acting as means, but not mere means for others. So, meaningful interaction without exploitation, but with giving the opportunity to be means for others. Thank you.
Yeah, so Corinna, and Gareth, in this paper, as well as in other papers, you do a great job at filling gaps that Kant leaves, filling them with plausible empirical material, or putting empirical meats on Kant's conceptual bones. I have three critical remarks. The first is on thesis A, namely that thesis A, instrumentalization. It seems to me that the idea of negative ends is a good way to spell out malice but not hostility, right? We can be hostile to someone else without specific reference to someone, specific reference to other status as ends in themselves. We may treat them as a danger, almost like a force of nature, or an obstacle that we must remove, regardless of whether the other person is an end in themselves or not, right? So that's my thought on thesis A. Then the second point is about thesis B, namely that it seems to me that, in a way, surprisingly, you're still, to some extent, committed to the instrumentalization paradigm that you criticize. I find it a bit odd and excessively Kantian, to some extent, to think that vulnerability to instrumentalization, on top of the actual instrumentalization, is one of the most pressing wrongs of poverty or mistreatment of the poor. Right? There is a sense in which instrumentalization is double-counted, right? So this, in a way, gives instrumentalization still a very large and important role in understanding poverty, which I would have thought that maybe if you really, if you are unhappy with the instrumentalization paradigm, maybe instrumentalization shouldn't have such a large role in understanding poverty. Moreover, maybe that's just my intuition, but if I were vulnerable to instrumentalization but never actually instrumentalized, I'm not sure that this would be bad necessarily, if I'm really never instrumentalized. Or you would have to show that just the mere danger of instrumentalization without any actual instrumentalization is already a fundamental badness of poverty. Yeah, and then also, one other aspect of that is if you're vulnerable to instrumentalization, it's not so clear who's actually doing the mistreatment or disrespecting of persons, right? It just seems to be a very general state of affairs that you're vulnerable. It's very hard to pin down who actually is inflicting this vulnerability on you, whereas if someone instrumentalizes you, it's relatively easy to see who's doing that, at least in standard cases. And then the last point is that, last comment is on thesis E, where I wonder if you're emphasizing the role of means too much. It seems to me that, I think what you're saying is that an exploitative employer fails to act as a means for the person she exploits, whereas a decent employer acts as a means for workers. But I find this a bit odd. It seems to me that an exploitative employer might act as a means for the person she exploits, if, for instance, the exploitation still makes her better off. Right? Often exploitative working conditions in sweatshops, for instance, aren't the worst possible option that someone has. There are even worse options. But we would still say that this is exploitative if someone works in a sweatshop. And clearly the employer fails to treat their workers as ends in themselves, right? But they might still act as means for them. So maybe that's another interesting category. You can act as a means for someone but still not treat them as ends, right? If you're allowing them to survive by doing a job that is exploitative, it seems to me then you're being a means for someone, not treating them as an end. These are my thoughts on your talk.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I hope you hear me. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Corinna, Gareth. I have only 5 minutes, so let me very quickly go through some virtues of your project, which I think it is great, from the more general to the more concrete. So first of all, it's great that you are framing the problem, or the normative problem of poverty, in terms of dignity or moral standing of human beings, thereby developing a thick concept of dignity, which I think is very much fruitful. The second thing is, I appreciated that you are giving this notoriously vague concept of exclusion a good content here. So understanding it in terms of the Reich der Zwecke, kingdom of ends. And I think this is a great job, actually. And as for a kingdom of ends, I see a kind of economical aspect in your interpretation, which has great potentialities. Dieter touched upon the topic of capitalism. Of course, we could take it in several ways. However your conception of capitalism is, I think in your way of understanding of kingdom of end, there is a way of, to be either an anti-capitalist or a critical about capitalism. I see a great potentialities here. And I see a lack about this topic in Kant Scholar too. But allow me to give you one challenge. I don't know if it would be a challenge or not, so this is my critical take from your project. I see that I see your aversion against virtue talk in your paper, because I see your concern that you want to frame poverty as a problem of justice, and I see also that you want to avoid this whole language of duties. But I think when I zoom in on your understanding of the concept of usefulness, or what you say be a means to others or for others' ends, you cannot actually avoid that. And here is my point. So how could we actually understand usefulness or act as a means for others? There is one prudential way, and I think Kant talks about it in the very famous footnote in the second section of groundwork, when he differentiates between worldly prudence and private prudence. And this is taken by itself not non-moral. So, it should be okay. It becomes immoral if it is very close to something which call alienation, which means you are means for some ends that they are actually not your ends. So you are not identifying yourself with your work. Or in a Marxian sense, the ends to which you are a means are not set by yourself. So, and I guess you want to avoid that. And in the moment you avoid this, in the moment you don't want to make the usefulness a case of alienation, you have to accept the duty of virtue, of promotion, of happiness of others. Because this duty, whether it's imperfect or perfect, is telling you, you have to promote the ends of others which are set by others themselves. Only in that case, they could be morally good means for the whole society. And the central passage you are referring to about, be a useful member of the world, you don't have to forget that. This is paragraph 20. It's about the duty of self-perfection. And I really believe that the class of duty of self-perfection and the class of duties of promotion of happiness of each other, they work in tandem. So the more you could morally actually promote the happiness of others, the more those people could fulfill their duty of self-perfection. So again, I see your concern to avoid the language of virtue, but I think it is unavoidable to include this story of promotion of the happiness in your account. Well, the big challenge would be, how would you reframe that in the language of justice? Thank you very much.